Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. I've got a very special guest with us today. And before I introduce her, I just want to tell you that if you find yourself interested in pursuing your TED-like talk, if you find yourself interested in making your communications even more impactful and connected and creating trust and loyalty, I've got a program. It's an 8-person cohort. It goes for 10 weeks and it is called the Speak Like a Leader experience. And you can find out more about that at that's for education, ed.executivespeakingsuccess.com. My why is to bring out what's awesome inside you so that you can have the impact you want to have in the world. And now let me introduce our guest. With me today is Sharon Guynup. She's an author, a journalist, an editor, a photographer, a producer, a speaker, a National Geographic explorer, a global fellow from the Wilson Center, and we met years ago when she was a speaker at TEDx Hoboken. Isn't that right, Sharon?
Yes, it is.
Well, and you know, just thinking back on that, just since that's where we met and where we're kind of starting this conversation, I do remember a somewhat different Sharon Guynup that I met that first day, right? Because you had been asked to speak at TEDx Hoboken, and speaking kind of wasn't your thing yet. Is that a way to say it?
Well, that was June of 2014. So It's more than 7 years ago at this point.
Wow.
And I was asked by the organizer to speak on tigers because myself and photographer Steve Winter,
who's also a big hero of mine, you two are so incredible.
National Geographic photographer, were going to be releasing a book at the end of the year on tigers. And I knew I was going to have to do book talks and readings. And I was utterly petrified of public speaking.
Yeah.
I mean,
I remember.
So badly that if I had to get up in situations and even just introduce someone, hello, this is blah, blah, whatever.
Yeah, right.
I had to have it on a piece of paper and read it, and my hands would be shaking.
Yeah. Yes.
So, this was a paralytic fear.
Yeah.
And I just knew that I was going to have to learn to do this because of the book. So I took the jump in the deep end approach and agreed to do it. And part of the reason I agreed to do it was because I was told that there would be some coaching, which was you.
Yeah. That's how I got into your life.
Yes. And I guess it was a good lengthy talk. It was, I don't know, somewhere 11, 12, 15, 14 minutes. It was long enough. And, and I didn't die. People didn't even know I was nervous, which was miraculous.
Yeah.
And, it really changed the course of my career moving forward. It gave me a much larger voice to share information from.
Yeah. And that's what I want to get to here in just a second, is all the things that you are up to and the things that make such a big difference. And I do just want to say that for me, I think people have even heard me say this on the show before, but look, public speaking should be scary. It's terrifying to get noticed by the group. Look what happened to Jesus and Joan of Arc and Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy and Socrates and on, right? So it makes total sense, right? And you are the example that you are an example of what I talk about all the time, which is that it's not about being fearless. Fearless, as my dad, the combat Marine, taught me, that'll get you killed. You don't want a fearless foxhole buddy, right? You want someone who has courage, someone who has their fear, but gets over their fear because something matters more to them than their fear. And for you in that moment, it was tigers forever. It was saving big, wild cats in the Wild. And I got to tell you, I have a couple of copies of that book upstairs. It sits where I see it all the time. I think of you all the time. It is an absolutely luscious, gorgeous, amazing book. So if you're listening to this and that sounds good, I mean, the photography in there and the writing and everything is just wonderful. And, you were scared, I remember, and you did it anyway. You had courage. So I want to thank you for stepping through that fear and doing it anyway, because now look at what you're doing, right? Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think I should take 12 steps backwards.
Okay.
I've had a lot of things to overcome in my life. My mother died when I was 14. I dropped out of high school when I was 16. It took me 8 years to get through college on my own. I studied photography. I picked up a camera. A camera is what compelled me. There was a real choice at one point whether I was going to be a photographer or a writer, and I continued to write. And, after some years working as a freelance photographer, I realized that I really wanted to learn to write. So I went to graduate school and I studied science and journalism in a master's program at NYU. The science was really tough because I was a high school dropout and I didn't study much science in college.
Yeah.
And I became a science writer. I write on science, environment, and health. And, not long out of grad school, I landed a job with the Wildlife Conservation Society in the Bronx. And I launched a book series for them called State of the Wild. And I wasn't seated with the PR people. I was seated with the biologists. So I had the chance to spend 2.5 years, going to these brown bag lunches, sitting down with scientists from around the world and learning about conservation biology.
Yeah.
So that was my training ground. And the first volume, 1/3 of content focused on hunting and the wildlife trade, and then all kinds of other environmental issues, ocean, land. And there was some climate change essays in that first book. The second volume, 1/3 of content focused on zoonotic disease, which, that was back in 2005.
Oh, man.
And epidemiologists and veterinarians and, public health officials were jumping up and down then about what we're living now, a pandemic such as this. So, it's so interesting the way one's, backgrounds weave together. Like, as a photographer, as a writer, I've had the opportunity to be in the field with biologists across the world in some very remote places. I've seen field science. I've been in labs. I've seen lab science. At this point in my career, I really want to weave together, all of it. Wildlife, ecosystems, the interconnectivity of life, the way that, human disturbance has created the Anthropocene, which is an age in which, every aspect of the planet, including, the geology of the planet, is impacted by human activity.
Yes.
So, again, that touches everything from, climate change to loss of species to pandemics.
Yeah.
So, within that context, it's really important to have a broad voice. When I started out as a photographer, photography was it. Carrying a camera on your shoulder, you were a weird person. Nobody did that, right?
You and Peter Parker, right?
So, and then I became a writer, and then, cell phones have now made, a very different kind of visual language that everyone shares, right?
Yeah.
And video has become a primary means of communication. Podcasts also, people want to listen, people want to see in a different way. So, I've made an effort to continue to expand my skills to both, incorporate other mediums, again, from public speaking and putting together panels and, to, consulting on films and writing and producing and doing voiceovers for multimedia pieces. And I think it's really important for me to continue to jump in the deep end.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean, it scares me at every step of the way. I must say, I chaired a panel for the Wilson Center on zoonotic disease and wildlife trafficking maybe 2 months ago with some of the world's top experts. I was so nervous.
Yeah.
And these people are brilliant. And look, I know what I know, and I work really hard to be as prepared as I ever can and to really get my stories right. I really, really am very diligent and careful. I live in dread fear of getting it wrong, which is also the reason I was, scared to death of public speaking.
Yes,
But I still get scared. I mean, sometimes I still feel the adrenaline rush. My heart pounds. Not as much. There's some situations where I'm doing a Zoom, I've been on a panel, I'm doing a talk, and I don't feel the adrenaline rush. And I've had this like funny little thought in the back of my head, like, look at this. No adrenaline rush. John would be so proud.
I'm just so proud that you stepped up and you keep stepping up, and you keep growing your platform and growing your voice. Because what you're talking about is just one of the most, many of the most crucial issues of our entire time, So.
Yes. I mean, look at, single out everything else from what we're calling the sixth extinction crisis, to, ever increasing emergence of infectious disease, most of which are zoonotic, meaning they pass between animals and humans. Yeah. But just look at climate change. Look at the way climate change has dramatically escalated over even the last 5 years. Yeah. The fire in Siberia right now is larger than all the other fires on the planet combined, including the huge fires in California, Greece, fires burning in Turkey. Yeah. There's drought, there's flood. Where I live in Hoboken, New Jersey, just about every time it rains now, there's a flash flood warning. And that's because in a warmer atmosphere, there's more water in the atmosphere. Yeah. But how many people died, in floods in Tennessee last week? The floods in Germany this summer, it's no longer like these 100-year events. It's every 5-minute events. Yeah.
100-year events every 5 minutes. And I'm sitting in Salt Lake City right now under just this fire driven haze that's coming all the way from California and Oregon. And, the sun is orange and we got to keep the windows closed and it smells like a campfire. And, it just rained on top of the Greenland ice sheet for the first time.
Yep.
Like it's never rained there in recorded history and it just rained. Like this is not really good news.
It's not an easy beat being a science environmental reporter. I mean, it's one colleague of mine calls it the doom and gloom beat.
Right. Well, but listen, just because we ignore it doesn't mean it'll go away, right?
Well, and the other thing is, look, that recent UN IPCC report that came out, it was not good news. But, if now we fight to save whatever species we can, if we fight to protect remaining wild lands. So, in case the climate does shift and land that a species needs to hunt for water, food, changes, right? And they need to move. There's room to move. Yeah. One thing I learned, one of the very first natural history stories I worked on in Costa Rica, as a photographer, was, a lesson in conservation in that people have protected the lands that it's been convenient to protect, or early on when a few individuals were prescient enough to say, we need to save this. But, what it means is that there's a few large tracts of land left on the planet. Yeah. And other than that, protected areas are what somebody once called green measles. is these
Right.
little protected spots that,
Yeah.
have no connectivity. Animals can't move between them.
Yeah.
There's, every kind of human development in between.
Yeah.
And so again, like when you add climate change to habitat loss and human population growth,
Yeah.
there were 3 billion people on the planet around the time I was born. We're going on 8 billion.
Yeah.
So, resource use and then add things like plastics. I mean, there is such an intense suite of threats
Yeah.
that it's particularly important to fight the good fight right now.
Yeah.
And save what we can, cut back carbon emissions, save land, regulate toxic chemicals that, are going to make us sick or damage children's brain development or,
and last for a long time in the environment.
Right. So, these are difficult problems and they're heavily interrelated.
Yeah.
But there are solutions, and there's a lot of really smart people coming out with brilliant solutions that are really unique. And I think it's important to look at the complexity of these problems, as they interrelate. But the obvious solution isn't always the best solution. And I've seen, many situations where using a counterintuitive approach brings, very surprising and successful results. So I think, it's really important for people to care, to act, to think differently. And every one of us can contribute in some way.
Yeah. Well, speaking of counterintuitive results, I think back to Hans Rosling's TED talk, where he shows the change in the developing world from big families and short lives to smaller families and longer lives. And, I think that for a lot of people, it was counterintuitive to think that saving lives could reduce population, right? What are you talking about? Well, when you save lives, people don't they feel like their kids are going to make it to adulthood and they don't have to have 20 so that a couple of them make it to adulthood. And I think that you're really right about there being solutions that are maybe counterintuitive or non-obvious right now. I think of all the articles that I've read in The Economist where they keep pointing out over and over that the cost of mitigating climate change is just far lower than the cost of dealing with it, and I think it's the same with all of this stuff. I read your article in is it Manga Bay?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And now if people want to find you, they can go to SharonGuynup.com. And there's some links there to a lot of the things that we're talking about. It's SharonGuynup.com. That'll be in the show notes. But in that article, we are still in the midst of what is truly an unprecedented global event. We've had global pandemics before, but never when we were this interdependent on each other, never when, there was this time in the world's history. And it's been disruptive, right? And we've known this was coming, like you said, since before 2005. And, I'd love to talk about some things that you think we could do to avoid the next one, because I think what I don't really want to think about right now as I'm just wishing this one was over is that there's another one right behind it if we don't take steps. So I'd love to talk about that. And I'd love to, hear a little bit, because I know in that article you talk about the impacts of this just on the global economy and things like that. And also wonder, if you've got any opinions about what we got wrong this time that we could maybe learn from for next time. So, I mean, anywhere you want to go with any of that, I'd just love to hear it, because I know you've been thinking about it.
Well, as I mentioned, I did a deep dive into zoonotic disease, back in 2005. And I remember talking to friends about it, and it was like, wow, I should really do a book on this. And they're like, who would read it? Literally, I was thinking about doing a book on it, and my friends discouraged me, and I didn't. But I spent 6 months talking to top experts, many of the same people that are currently being interviewed in the media for the last year and a half.
Yeah.
I learned, that about 70% of human infectious diseases originate in animals. Let's face it, we share a planet, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I've done lots of work over the years. I'm just about to, finish up like a third in a series of articles. One was an overview. One looked at infectious diseases that livestock and humans give to wildlife. And a third one looks at the longer history of diseases that are passed between animals and humans. And I think it's very interesting to note that back in prehistory, there were infectious, diseases. I mean, disease, viruses, bacteria are part of nature and ecology. And in a landscape in balance, things pretty much balance out, right? I mean, the beings that share that landscape with bacteria and viruses develop immunity. There's a balance, everything's okay. Once you start, ripping up a forest, then animal populations change, often more, mice and disease vectors like ticks and mosquitoes come in, fleas, just other like disease carriers, disease vectors tend to move in to take in and, take over in an imbalanced ecosystem.
Yeah.
And then you're putting people and animals in close proximity to all kinds of wildlife species.
Right.
And, none of them have immunity to each other's microbes.
Yeah.
They don't belong together. You're putting people and other primates, non-human primates and primates together. They share a lot of DNA. It's very easy for things to pass between them. Mammals can pass diseases very, very easily. So, it's quite obvious that, a few activities are the most dangerous, and they never are calculated into environmental assessment impacts, right?
Right.
So, if you're going to put a pig farm in the middle of a forest and there's bats there, you're going to disturb bat roosting areas. They're going to They're going to roost over farms, and then Nipah virus, and that goes to humans. Bats to pigs to humans, right?
And I was going to say, let's just plant a whole bunch of really tasty mangoes for the bats right over the pig crates, and bingo.
Yes. So, I mean, that's a hands-on description, So obviously certain kinds of development, particularly in rainforest areas that are rich biodiverse areas and ripping up the rainforest, roads through, et cetera, that brings people and livestock and domestic animals in touch with wildlife and look at where we are, right? The other thing is, eating some kinds of bushmeat is really dangerous. You can't eat chimps,
Right.
I mean,
should be off the menu.
Right. We have Ebola, we have, HIV, both of which appear to have passed to humans from, apes, probably chimps, maybe gorillas. And then, last but not least, a large threat is the wildlife trade.
Yes.
And that's, both legal trade and illegal trade. There's a lot of focus on illegal wildlife trade because that includes endangered species. So that also has extinction risk, right?
Yeah.
But legally traded animals can carry disease too. It
Just
might not be,
easily,
So, a microbe doesn't care whether it's legal or illegal, right? And many, many animals are sold in these open wildlife markets, like across Asia and Africa, and also in Latin America. And there's cages stacked on top of each other, and it'll be like wild birds and poultry and maybe some pigs thrown in and some civets and some snakes and some pangolins and,
right.
you know, and just everything. And they're all sharing, you know, I'll be, you know, I won't be gross. I'll say they're all sharing body fluids.
Yeah. No, they're pooping on each other. They're peeing on each other.
And swapping microbes. And they've come from all over the planet. And they're stacked together in, you know, what essentially becomes one big microbial petri dish.
Well, I mean, I just have ethical issues with that in the first place. Like I think maybe secretly in my heart, I care about wild animals more than I even care about people. But I realize that the only way I can do anything for wild animals is by doing something for people. But so, I mean, in the first place, I just think it's just makes me so incredibly sad to see those pictures and to think about just the sheer quantity of suffering that is. And then there's the impact that it has on us and human beings as a species. And now, you know, I've been saying for this whole pandemic, you know, it's our opportunity to have that understanding that this is one world, you know, like the astronauts have when they look down from orbit and they see the whole planet in one view. And I don't necessarily know that we've made the most of that. What I started saying soon after that is we're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, you know? But
so yes, I mean, there's very obvious, you know, empathy and animal welfare issues, but, you know, with many people, that's a harder sell.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, again, culturally, our perception of animals, you know, changes in many places around the world. But I think there's been a lot more attention to this issue because of this pandemic, because it's a lot easier, you know, it's a lot easier for people to understand when they're stuck at home, you know, their kids can't go to school, they've lost their job, you know, they're isolated by themselves, they haven't seen their, you know, their mother in a year, you know, or, you know, whatever it is. It's just
their
like
father-in-law's about to die on a ventilator and no one can even go hold his hand.
People have lost loved ones, friends, you know, people that they know have long COVID and have, you know, serious neurological problems, memory problems, lung issues, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, suddenly, you know, this kind of vague idea that nobody wanted to think about has become far more real. And you know, there was a pandemic surveillance program that was established under the Obama administration that was dismantled under the Trump administration in 2017. But even a program like that doesn't go anywhere near far enough. And the kind of global outcry we're hearing right now also doesn't go anywhere near far enough because it focuses strictly on surveillance and vaccines and treatments. But none of that has, you know, any impact on this happening again.
The direct root causes.
Unless we're going to look at the ways that our human activities are facilitating this jump of microbes between species. You know, the next pandemic is literally like the next plane ride away. Yeah. So, you know, I've been working on this story about the history of zoonotics, right? So think back, the plague. Yeah. A ship, a tall ship pulls into port. Yep. On board, there's a lot of sick and dead sailors. Yeah. That ship is put in quarantine for 30 days. Yep. That word quarantine was coined for ships that weren't allowed into port because of disease. Right? Okay. So, you know, since they left wherever they came from, you know, months have gone by, right? Yeah. And, you know, people got sick, it got passed around, a lot of people died, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you can jump on a plane infected with a new emerging disease that no one had ever heard of, like COVID-19, right? Yeah. Like back in, say, you know, December 2019 or January 2020, you could get on a plane infected with this thing that nobody even knew what it was yet, You could fly across the planet. You could be there, going to parties, going to business meetings, going to a massive convention, around 1 million of people in bars. And then suddenly you come down with symptoms, and then a couple of weeks later, you're really sick and you go to the hospital. And again, people don't know what this is. Maybe you have pneumonia and you're spreading it all over the place. Super spreader, one person, because of the way we have, been able to expedite international travel, international trade. It means that these new emerging diseases can now be spread around the globe within days.
Yeah.
So, this is not an issue to ignore. Just like climate change, galloping climate change that, is bit by bit ripping the planet apart. We can't ignore these massive, massive issues just because corporate profits prefer that we continue on this path.
Well, I mean, that's why I keep, I keep thinking about The Economist, because it's not like they don't like corporations. It's not like they don't like international trade, but even a magazine like The Economist is very clear, and it's very simple to see that like mitigating this is just going to be vastly less costly than dealing with it.
Let me give you 2 examples.
Both of these issues, by the way.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, I was sitting in a lecture on climate change by some researchers from University of Miami. And, they were, really ahead of the curve because, Miami was flooding through the sewers every time it rained. Yeah. Right. So flooding began there far earlier than, many, many other places. And I remember that researcher telling us that the first people to be really pushing to address climate change was the insurance industry.
Exactly.
Because they understood the financial implications, not just of flood, but of drought and fires, right?
Yes.
Here's a second example that looks at zoonotic disease. In a normal year without a pandemic, there are more than 1 billion zoonotic disease cases that kill roughly 1 million people. That's a normal year without anything extraordinary. Kills 1 million people, right? Wow. The SARS outbreak in 2003, that was in 8 countries, right? It didn't become a global pandemic, but it was scary. It was not as contagious as this coronavirus. It too is a coronavirus, but it cost $40 billion. In contrast, a U.S. congressional report that came out in June projects the cost of lost economic output from COVID-19 at $28 trillion. $28 trillion.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about whether, you get to go put a new palm oil plantation in Indonesia, like cutting down the rainforest, and, killing some of the last, orangutans and whatever else. Again, conservation issues aside, that is a price tag that every one of us pays for corporate profits.
Yeah. Yep.
So, what experts like Steve Osofsky at Cornell emphasize, he's a veterinarian that was one of the early architects of a One Health approach to not only health, but planetary health, right? That understands that human health, wildlife health, and ecosystem health are inextricably linked. And, if we're going to have a healthy planet with, clean air to breathe and clean water to drink and food to eat, then we need to consider environmental impacts in our economic decisions. And ever more so moving forward, for all those reasons, for our own survival, but also because of the zoonotic disease threat.
I mean, one of the things, this is a whole other discussion in itself, but one of my three of my favorite books in the whole entire wide world are Guns, Germs, and Steel, 1491, and 1493. And one of the things that I just have not been able to keep thinking about over and over and over is the fact that, at least in North and South America, this is not the first time that this has happened. And my understanding from the book 1491, which is about the pre-Columbian Americas, is that there were just vastly, all caps, more people here than anybody ever thought, until we finally got better at realizing what actually was going on. And that initial contact with Columbus, before anybody came over on the Mayflower or any of that, wiped out something like 80% of the population on both continents because of what were essentially zoonotic diseases that Europeans just had become endemic, right?
Well, it was both zoonotic and infectious diseases, but smallpox was the big one, right?
Yep.
Influenza, there were flus that were very deadly that, again, no immunity to. There's also things like syphilis, right?
Right.
So all of those were old world diseases, not new world diseases.
Yeah. Yes.
So yes, that's one, really good example. Hey, the plague came from Central Asia, right? Yep. And spread across the globe. With numerous, very, very deadly outbreaks.
Waves,
that killed off, much of the European population. Plagues like we can't even imagine now.
Exactly. And there's just nothing that doesn't say that the next one couldn't be even more contagious and even more deadly.
Well, hey, we're very lucky that Ebola doesn't live well in the atmosphere, right?
If Ebola transmitted the way that COVID transmits, this whole thing
aerosol,
a whole lot.
Exactly.
Right. Exactly.
But I think it's very, very important to note that it's not that animals are the enemy.
No.
And I think early on, decades ago, when more epidemics started to appear, there was more emerging diseases that really started appearing, greater frequency, around the 1950s, an era that's called the Great Acceleration, when suddenly human population really grew, as a result of antibiotics specifically, right? And development really grew dramatically across the country. It was across the nation, right? Suddenly, massive deforestation and development, and with it, much greater frequency of emerging zoonotic diseases, right?
I don't think I realized that, Sharon.
Yes. Starting around then, it increased dramatically as a result of our human activity and population growth. That is now spread more easily. So it's a 1-2 punch, really, right?
Yeah.
So was there a part of that question I didn't answer?
No. I think the thing that I would wonder about, maybe there is it's just embarrassing to me how badly we failed this test as a planet, and I wonder what lessons you think we could learn from what I think is just an unmitigated disaster of a response, Well,
I do remember what I wanted. One last point I wanted to make with that last question. I was saying that early on, some of the response was killing animals. If they're giving us the diseases, let's kill animals.
Get rid of them, yeah.
Which made the problem far worse because it further disturbed ecosystems, and then the more out of balance, the more problems, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Again, especially things like mice and other vectors, right?
Right.
Rodents.
Right.
But there's a lot of species that carry a lot of diseases. Again, to to animals we wouldn't even imagine. Like we only discovered, I think, in the 1970s or thereabouts, that canine distemper takes out big cats.
Oh.
And, there's been epidemics that, killed some of the last Siberian tigers in Siberia, that killed, many, many Serengeti lions.
Oh.
And it also infects like wild dogs and African wild dogs, which are heavily endangered species. So, that's us bringing our dogs into wild places, right? I mean,
yes.
I think the lessons, if we're going to pay attention, is that, going after short-term profits, for a growingly select group of people, is going to drive this planet to destruction. Unless we start, calculating, what's being called economic capital, right? And what ecosystem services provide.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to rip out that wetland and put in a strip mall?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, if you rip out that wetland and pave it over, the next heavy rain, that whole development, the houses, everything's going to flood. And then there's flood damage, right?
Yep.
So, wetlands buffer from flooding.
Yeah.
That's one small example that people don't think of. Forests, filter drinking water for millions of people.
Yeah.
Forests store carbon and, help mitigate climate change. You really want to cut down that forest? And then, again, it's a tropical forest that, have a lot of bat species, have a lot of mammals. There's a lot of, potential disease transfer between hoofed animals and your hoofed livestock, et cetera, et cetera. So, unless we start thinking differently and making decisions that include both world health and planetary health and the overall costs of mitigation.
Yeah.
I can't see us making any progress. But again, if you're talking about, COVID-19 with a price tag of $28 trillion.
Right.
Shouldn't that be enough to make people think twice?
I certainly hope so. I'm cautiously hopeful that we will end up learning something out of this. I do think that one of the things that you and your experience and your comments keep pointing to is what we were talking about a little bit before the podcast, which is just the I think incredible rising importance of understanding things contextually and understanding things relationally. That seems to be one of the top most endangered species in every bit of news that we get to see, right? Like all context is stripped out. All relationship is stripped out. It's just the clickbait and the short title, and people don't really dig down and understand. And yet I think that now that's more important than it probably ever has been because of just the incredible complexity.
Well, I'm so glad you raised that. I think back to, earlier points in both my career and, my partner, photographer Steve Winter's career. Yes. Steve has been a National Geographic photographer, doing wildlife stories for, more than 20 years. And decades ago, you were given, weeks in the field to, go and photograph a story or report a story. Yeah. There's very, very few publications now that pay for field time. Obviously we can't travel right now because of COVID restrictions. Yeah. But you just have to bang out quick stories and journalism actually in many venues, many outlets pay less than they did when I graduated from grad school 20 years ago. So, in order to continue doing our work, Steve has produced 3 one-hour documentaries, numerous stories for National Geographic. He speaks globally for National Geographic Live, and and I report on a wide range of environmental issues. In order to continue doing our work with some collaborators, a couple of filmmakers, Bertie Gregory, Alex Brzezowski, and others, we're launching a nonprofit called Big Cat Voices, which will be launched very soon. And through that, we are trying to fund important wildlife conservation, ecosystem, climate change stories and zoonotic disease, all those issues. That's our core issues. We're trying to fund stories and films through this nonprofit because that will allow us to continue to have the impact that we want to have.
Yeah.
And both Steve and I have done work that has led to tangible impact.
Yes.
I did a year-long investigation into a tiger venue in Thailand, the Thai Tiger Temple, that was a Buddhist monastery that doubled as a tiger petting attraction. It brought in about $3 million a year, on the books, just with tourism.
Right.
But I was able to prove that they were breeding, killing, and shipping tigers into the Asian black market trade to China. And 4 months later, after that published in National Geographic, under serious pressure, the Thai government shut it down and confiscated, the rest of what had been 178 tigers.
Oh man! God.
It was something that Steve did. He spent 2 years working on a story on cougars in the United States, which are also mountain lions. They have a lot of names, right? Same species. And he photographed them in the wild in Wyoming, and he photographed them in Southern California, because there's a lot in the hills there, right?
Yeah.
And, Steve gets these ideas in his head. He decided that he wanted a picture of a cat under the Hollywood sign. And he got in touch with the biologist working there, Jeff Sikich, and told him that. Jeff laughed at him. And 6 months later, he said, I don't know how it happened, but a cat crossed the 8-lane 101 freeway, and they're in Griffith Park in LA.
Yeah.
So Steve set up camera traps. It took him 14 months, but he got that picture. There's a night shot of that cougar P22 under the Hollywood sign.
Yeah.
Nat Geo broke protocol and didn't run that picture, but another picture of P22 with the lights of LA behind ran on the cover of the LA Times even before the Nat Geo story ran.
Yep.
And P22,
I distinctly remember that.
Yes, P22 became a celebrity and became the poster animal for the need for a wildlife overpass to connect the only 2 protected areas there in Southern California, not just for cougars, but for
for everything,
for all the area's wildlife. And a lot of people worked really hard, and Steve donated those pictures for use.
Yeah.
One nonprofit, the National Wildlife Federation, a woman named Beth Pratt, did a life-size print, a cutout. She carried it around to the governor's office, to funders, to
awesome.
California transportation agencies, and they're breaking ground this year on what will be California's first wildlife overpass and the largest wildlife overpass in the world.
That's so great.
Media can make a difference, but it's not just media. We can all make a difference.
Yeah. Well, just because I'm proud of it, here in Salt Lake City, just up the road from where we live, crossing I-80 is a very big wildlife overpass. And they even have, I think they have a camera there, and you can see like the bear and the moose and all this stuff that go across there. And that's what I think about every time I drive anywhere. I just want to put overpasses or underpasses everywhere. And just as I drive past the staggering amounts of roadkill, I'm just like, wow, why couldn't we just, every time we build a road, we just gotta every so often put something that goes under or something that goes over so that we just didn't have to just needlessly kill this many animals every day, day in, day out, you know.
Well, there's ways that it could be done strategically. I mean, certainly connecting protected areas is important.
Yeah, of course. That's the first, yes.
And in the West, I mean, there's a bunch of overpasses and underpasses. I think I saw one in Wyoming. I mean, there's various places around the West. Like there's pronghorn migrations. There's migration routes that would be really key. There's a very famous wildlife overpass. I think it's up in Banff, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So it's a model that works, and that's the point. Look. Like, we can't erase the roads, right?
Right.
So what do? So we can build, find the best way to build overpasses and the most strategic places to put them. Find the design that animals are most, welcome to embrace, right? And actually use, right?
Yeah.
There are answers, there are mitigations, but there's also hard choices that have to be made. We can't just do whatever we want and then think we can fix it.
Yeah.
And I think if people understand the broader context, perhaps we can all think differently. And I think that's why it's important to me to not only use a wide range of mediums to put information out to the public, which is my job as a journalist, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But to also include the history and context that is, again, so often missing from news stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, amen. Amen to that. I mean, yes, I'm all for that. Please keep doing it. So, I know that we're getting to about an hour, and I told you I wouldn't keep you too long, but is there anything that we didn't talk about yet that you just, like, if I just, tell us anything you think's important or that you'd like us to know?
Well, even though my job is really hard, look, everybody's job is hard, right? I work very, very long hours. I often don't have weekends off. Journalism does not pay a lot of money, no matter what your reputation is, unless you have a staff job, and there's very few of those. Yeah. But I have had such an amazing opportunity to be out in beautiful, magnificent parts of this planet. I've seen jaguars in the wild. Oh. I've seen tigers in the wild and leopards and, Africa and India and Latin America and often, staying in rustic, bug infested, look out for the poisonous snakes, research stations and, just these fabulous, experiences. And then working with some of the world's most brilliant minds who take the time to talk to me about their work because it's important to get it out there. Scientific journals are important, but that's scientists like speaking to their colleagues and furthering the science. But to get the work out there, to get their research out there where it can make a difference, it has to get to the public, to inform the public, and it has to get out to policymakers. And I think that's the last thing that I'll mention is that the most recent part of my own evolution, has come over the last 5 years. I was fortunate enough to be granted, a residential fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., which is it's part of the Smithsonian, and it was established to inform public policy. They let a journalist in every now and then. Well, they welcome journalists every now and then. I don't want to at all. It could sound anything what it is, but it is the most collegial, brilliant group of people I have ever had the opportunity to be around. And, over 5 years, working with both the environment program and the China environment program, I have learned so much about both domestic public policy, international public policy, national security issues, and just a wide range of perspectives that were not previously part of my considerations when I was looking into stories.
Yeah.
So, and again, I went through further media training there, which was, again, further advanced my skills. And, again, I speak on panels and chair panels, and it's a DC audience that includes both, nonprofits and decision makers.
Yeah.
So that has been an incredible opportunity, and I continue to learn. And it's also made me aware of the fact that everything that we have been discussing today, all of the issues we've been discussing today, are national and international security issues.
Absolutely, yes.
And raising like wildlife trafficking, for example, to a national and international security issue about 8 years ago. The Brits did a great job of putting it on the table. Prince William, Prince Charles, Hillary Clinton was part of that as well. And it changed the focus. As long as something like wildlife trafficking was an environmental issue, it was way down on the totem pole of national importance. Once it becomes a national security issue, which it is because of corruption and because of the players. I mean, this isn't, often like poaching is like, oh, there's a few poor people and they need to make a living. And the real issue is that, these are international crime syndicates that, traffic wildlife, as another product in the portfolio, along with guns and drugs and human trafficking operations. It actually ranks number 4 in that list as the top 4, most lucrative illegal substances traveled, or commodities trafficked around the world. And so, this is organized crime. So it's, it's not just a biodiversity crisis. It's not just a disease risk. It's also a security issue. And I think, again, I don't think I would have understood that to quite the degree that I do now if I hadn't had the opportunity to, be around such brilliant experts over these last couple of years. And I do remain, affiliated. It's something I, greatly value. So, I think in general, I love what I do. Being a photographer is really fun. Writing is much harder work. Being a photographer is more fun. But it is really great to, continue to learn and do new things.
Yeah.
Which, you do as a journalist anyway, because as you're reporting your next story, you're talking to experts, you're doing research. It's kind of like living through end of the semester in college for the rest of your life. In terms of deadlines, right? Yeah. But it's really a fascinating life, and I love what I do. I really do. And I hope that Steve and my work, Big Head Voices, our colleagues, we can continue to, inform people, inform the public, inform policymakers in ways that really help us, save this planet's last wild places, save disappearing wildlife, and, help us save ourselves.
Yeah.
I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter, and, I want a beautiful world for her to grow up in. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a 5-year-old son. Same thing. And, I think I just can't help saying it. At the end of the day, all of this stuff, it's not about saving the whales. It's not about saving the earth. Like, the earth is going to be fine. It'll shrug us off like nothing if it needs to. And the earth in 100,000 years will be fine, I think. it's about saving ourselves, really. And in order to save ourselves, I think we have to begin, not just begin, but actually completely understand just how much we are a part of the entire global ecosystem, and understand how incredibly dependent we are at the end of the day on those wild places being there and being as healthy and functional as we can have them be. That isn't just about the wild places. I mean, in my heart, yeah, maybe it is, but that's about saving a functional global civilization for ourselves.
I will say it again. I mean, animal health, human health, and ecosystem health are inextricably linked. And,
yes.
And, if we save wildlife, we save nature, we save ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fabulous. And, I'm going to put a link to Tigers Forever, because I very much encourage you to go take a peek at it and get a copy for your coffee table. It is beautiful. And is Big Cat Voices up on the web yet? Is there a working website yet, or?
It will be soon. I think we're probably going to launch the website in about a month. So yeah, we're right on the edge here.
Right on. Well, the minute you launch, let me know, and I will make sure to let everyone know where that is. And I assume you're a co-founder of Big Cat Voices.
I am.
Very good. And if you want to find Sharon, she's at SharonGuynup.com, SharonGuynup.com. And Sharon, it's just so great to catch up with you. And I, again, just want to acknowledge you for doing all the things you do to step up to the plate and make the difference you're committed to making. You're somebody that I think about on an almost daily basis as an example of just stepping through whatever that next barrier might be, because what you're up to just matters too much not to, right?
That's true. But if we're doing this mutual admiration society, doing that TED Talk was probably the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my entire life.
Yeah.
I literally had my first and only panic attack when I was preparing for it.
Yeah.
Just for some history, when I was in first grade and they made me be in a school play, I was so traumatized, I fainted, fell on the stage, split my head open. Ambulance came and stitched my head back together. I was so terrified of making a mistake in public on a stage with people looking at me. Yeah. I don't know where that fear came from, but this was not just, I don't like public speaking. This was terrifying. And I could not have done it without you both helping me write it and hone it, but also you coaching me on how to present and giving me whatever shred of confidence I could muster. And also, in the end, both you and the organizer, allowed me to have notes. I practiced as well as I could, but if I was going to freeze up there during the headlights, I was going to be okay. And, I think I maybe read a sentence here and there. You couldn't tell I was reading. It was so well rehearsed. Yeah. And again, I didn't die.
You didn't die.
And it sounded okay. And you know what? With that one talk, jumping in the deep end with your help, I probably burned away a good 60% of my fear in one fell swoop.
That's so great.
And it's opened up whole worlds for me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're beyond welcome. You're very, very welcome. And shout out to Elizabeth Berry, who was the organizer of TEDx Hoboken and who had the good sense, I think, and wisdom to break the rules and let you take your notes up there. And I distinctly remember the fact that someone overcoming their fear is vastly more inspiring than somebody who's fearless, and you were a really big inspiration. I'm so glad. I'm so glad we got brought together, and thank you so much for that. And you're very welcome.
And thank you for, inviting me on your show today, and onward and forward.
Onward and forward. And I'm going to encourage everybody to follow you, to check out the things you write. I think what you're writing about is just, I can't imagine more important things than what you're writing about. So I'm happy to introduce you to everyone and anyone who listens. And, I look forward to talking again, and I wish you all the best with everything. If I can help in any way, you know that I'm at your service.
Thank you so much, and be safe and be well.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week on SpeakLikeALeader.show. Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.